Hello, everyone. Welcome to our video conference entitled Early Christmas Customs and Practices. We apologize for the delay. We have some technical issues, but now things are fixed. It's again that time of the year that we all are really excited about and waiting for. That's why we have this conference too, to celebrate Christmas, to honor the Nativity of Jesus. And it's an annual thing, so I can safely now say that it is our custom as Orthodox Academy of Crete and after Constantine Journal and medievalists.net to have this conference. I won't speak too much longer. I invite the General Director of the Orthodox Academy of Crete, Dr. Konstantinos Zorbas, to say his greeting. Dr. Zorbas, we can hear you.
Good afternoon. I try to speak in Greek. Θα ήθελα και εγώ με τη σειρά μου να καλωσορίσω τους φίλους και τις φίλες που συμμετέχουν σε αυτό το διαδικτυακό σεμινάριο. Καλή νεσπέρα σε όλους και εκ μέρους του Σεβασμιωτάτου Μητροπολίτη μας Χυσάμου και Σελήνου, κυρίου Αμφιλοχίου Προέδρου της Ακαδημίας και του προσωπικού της Ακαδημίας, καλώς ευρεθήκαμε και πάλι σε διαδικτυακή αυτή συνάντηση, η οποία είναι και η τελευταία του έτους για μας, αν και έχουμε κάποιες μικρές δραστηριότητες την ερχόμενη εβδομάδα. Η μέρα των Χριστουγέννων στις 25 Δεκεμβρίου είναι μία από τις πρόσφατες, θα λέγαμε, εορτές του Ιησού Χριστού που καθιερώθηκε στην Ορθόδοξη Εκκλησία, γιατί άρχισε να τηρείται περίπου στα τέλη του 4ου αιώνα. Μάλιστα, ο Ιωάννης ο Χρυσόστομος άφησε μια σπουδαία ομιλία στην Αντιόχεια που μας βοηθά να καθορίσουμε ίσως την ακριβή ημερομηνία κατά την οποία εορτάστηκε για πρώτη φορά αυτό το μεγάλο γεγονός. Ο Ιωάννης Χρυσόστομος χρησιμοποιεί τον όρο «γέννηση του Χριστού κατά σάρκα». «Σήμερον τεχθέντος κατά σάρκα προσδοκάτε Χριστού», γράφει ακριβώς. Και συνεχίζει. Δεν έχουν περάσει ακόμη 10 χρόνια από τότε που αυτή η ημέρα έγινε φανερή και γνωστή σε εμάς. Και πιο κάτω στην ομιλία του λέει, αυτή η μέρα είναι παντού θέμα συζήτησης, γιατί κάποιοι την κατηγορούν ότι είναι μια καινούρια γιορτή και ότι εισήχθη στη λειτουργική ζωή της Εκκλησίας πρόσφατα, ενώ άλλοι υποστηρίζουν ότι είναι μια παλιά γιορτή, γιατί οι προφήτες είχαν προφητεύσει πριν από πολύ καιρό. Και υποστηρίζουν ότι πριν από καιρό έχει αποκαλυφθεί και ήταν γνωστή η γιορτή από τους κατοίκους των περιοχών που από την Θράκη μέχρι Γαδύρων. Γαδύρων είναι η αρχαία πόλη Γάδυρα στο στενό του Γιβραλτάρ. Έτσι λοιπόν γνωρίζουμε ότι τα Χριστούγεννα είναι η εορτή της γέννησης του Χριστού, γιορτάστηκε στην Αντιόχεια, στο αρχαιότερο χριστιανικό κέντρο έξω από την Ιερουσαλήμ και βέβαια όχι πριν από το 376 μετά Χριστόν. Ο Γρηγόριος ο Ναζιαζινός σε μία πάλι ομιλία του δίδει μια άλλη διάσταση, την ταυτίζει με την ημέρα των φώτων και σημειώνει ότι είναι η μέρα κατά την οποία οι κατηχούμενοι όταν βαπτίζονται φωτίζονται μαζί με τον Χριστό, όπως λέει χαρακτηριστικά «Χριστός συμφωτιστήνε». Η παλαιότερη όμως αναφορά είναι για τη γιορτή της βάφτισης του Ιησού, είναι από τον Κλίμη της Αλεξανδρίας, ο οποίος αναφέρει ότι η αίρεση του Βασιλίδη, να πούμε εδώ ότι ο βασιλιδιανισμός είναι από τα σημαντικότερα κινήματα του γνωστικισμού και ο ιδρυτής του υπήρξε ο Βασιλίδης που έδρασε κυρίως στον 2ο αιώνα. Σημειώνει λοιπόν ότι ο Βασιλίδης τιμά αυτήν την ημέρα, αυτή τη γιορτή, με αγρυπνία και διαβάζοντας βιβλικά αναγνώσματα. Από τότε λοιπόν αρχίζει στην χριστιανική μας εκκλησία η εκκλησιαστική ιστορία, αυτή η φανέρωση του Θεού εν σαρκί, Αυτή η γέννηση του Θεού ως ανθρώπου είναι το μεγαλύτερο γεγονός όλων των εποχών και όλων των αιώνων. Και τα Χριστούγεννα, σαν εορτή της γεννήσεως του Θεού ως ανθρώπου, ως θεανθρώπου, είναι αρχή όλων των εκκλησιαστικών εορτών των χριστιανών, η αρχή όλων των εκκλησιαστικών γεγονότων της χριστιανοσύνης. Όλα αυτά τα σημαντικά, τα οποία αλλάζουν τα δεδομένα της καθημερινότητας των ανθρώπων, θα μας τα παρουσιάσουν και θα έχουμε τη χαρά να ακούσουμε στη συνέχεια τις παρεμβάσεις της κυρίας Ελίζα Εμάλντι από την Ιταλία, τον καθηγητή Ολέγκ Ουλιανόφ από τη Ρωσία, τον διδάκτορα και κληρικό Γκάμπριελ Πίστα από τη Ρουμανία, την κυρία διδάκτορα Λίντα Βόκτ Τούρνερ από τον Καναδά και φυσικά τον αγαπητό Τζον Γκάλαχερ από την Ιρλανδία, όπως σε συνεργασία με το Διεθνές Μεσαιωνικό Δίκτυο Medievallist και το Επιστημονικό Ψηφιακό Περιοδικό After Constantine και την Ορθόδοξη Ακαδημία Κρήτης, ότι οργανώθηκε αυτή η συνάντηση. Να ευχαριστήσω και τη ζωή της Τζιάμ για όλη την προσπάθεια, την προετοιμασία, για ό,τι κάνει τόσο για το περιοδικό όσο και τις επιστημονικές ημερίδες. Θα ήθελα όμως εν συντομία να έρθω στο σήμερα. Και συγκεκριμένα χθες ήταν μια μικρή γιορτή κοντά εδώ σε ένα χωριό, κοντά στην Ακαδημία, όπου διαπίστωσα ένα κομμάτιασμα της φράσης την οποία διαβάζουμε την ημέρα της εορτής και στο κατά Λουκάν Ευαγγέλιο, κεφάλαιο 2, παράγραφος 14. Είναι το γνωστό «Δόξα εν υψίστοις Θεό και επί γης ειρήνη εν ανθρώπης ευδοκία». Glory to God in the higher heaven κτλ. Βρέθηκα λοιπόν εκεί έκπληκτος, διότι πήρανε ένα κομμάτι για να τονίσουν βέβαια τη σημασία της ειρήνης στην εποχή μας με αυτά τα οποία γίνονται στη γειτονιά μας, και επί γης ειρήνη, αφαιρώντας το δόξα εν υψίστοις Θεό και το εν ανθρώπης ευδοκία. Έχω την εντύπωση ότι αυτός ο ένος, αυτή η δοξολογία, αν θέλετε, στη ζωή μας, είναι μία ευχαριστία και μία ελπίδα. Αλλά δυστυχώς όταν την κομματιάζουμε, όταν καμματιάζουμε αυτόν τον ύμνο, χάνει τη σημασία του. Εάν πούμε στην οριζόντια διάσταση της σχέσης του ανθρώπου με το Θεό, δηλαδή το δόξαν υψίστοις Θεό μόνο του, αυτό περισσότερο μας μεταφέρει σε ένα προσωπικό σωτήρα, στον οποίο αποδίδει πολλά από τα γνωρίσματα από αυτό που έχουμε τον προσωπικό μας υπολογιστή, τον personal computer. Υπάρχει ένας ατομικισμός και μία ενδοστρέφεια, θα λέγαμε, η μονομέρεια αυτή, που ανοίγει τον περίγυρο και τις καθολικές προϋποθέσεις μιας δοξολογικής αναφοράς στο λυτρωτή του παντός. Εάν πάμε στην οριζόντια διάσταση, δηλαδή και επί γης ειρήνη, είναι ο τύπος της ευσέβειας που βλέπει στο πρόσωπο του Χριστού μόνο ένα κοινωνικό επαναστάτη, που υπόσχεται ειρήνη και ευημερία με ανθρώπινα κριτήρια και μέτρα. Και επειδή η εποχή μας έχει συντρίψει μαζί με τους επαναστάτες και την ίδια την ιδέα της επαναστάσεως, ένας τέτοιος Χριστός δυστυχώς αποβάλλεται μαζί με τα περιτά της παγκόσμιας ιστορίας. Υπάρχει όμως αυτή η τρίτη διάσταση που αγκαλιάζει, αν θέλετε, τις δύο προηγούμενες και στα ελληνικά ονομάζεται ευδοκία. Δόξα εν υψίστοις Θεό και επί γης ειρήνη εν ανθρώπης ευδοκία. Αυτό το ευδοκήν, η καλή, η αγαθή, αν θέλετε, θέληση του Θεού για τον άνθρωπο, η οποία γίνεται και αγαθή θέληση και προθυμία και πράξη και φιλαλληλία και αγάπη του ανθρώπου προς τον συνάνθρωπό του, ίσως, αν θέλετε, κατ' εμέ, είναι το μεγαλύτερο μήνυμα της εορτής των Χριστουγέννων, το οποίο θα πρέπει να το κρατήσουμε ως κόρην οφθαλμού. Με αυτές τις σύντομες σκέψεις, ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ όλες και όλους. Ήρθε η εμπειρία των θλιβερών συνεπειών της αποσπασματικότητας στη θέαση των θείων και των ανθρωπίνων πραγματοτήτων να μας επιτρέψει φέτος μια συνολική πρόληψη του ύμνου των αγγέλων, ώστε να γίνει και δικό μας βίωμα σωτηρίας και χαρμονής. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Σε ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, Ζωή, γιατί κάνεις. Έχεις το λόγο για τη συνέχεια.
Thank you, Dr. Zorbas. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ for your greeting and those loving words. Now I shall pass the microphone to Peter Konieczny, who is the co-founder of medievalist.net. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And thank you to everybody at After Constantine and the Orthodox Academy of Crete for setting up this conference. We had a wonderful one about Easter earlier this year, and I think these are really wonderful papers and things to talk about. Just say about, with Christmas in the Middle Ages, it's been often an interesting and much loved topic on medievalist.net. We've posted many articles kind of related to Christmas traditions. I think there's a groundswell of people that love to know how Christmas traditions can go back into the past, go back into the medieval past. And there's always this kind of interest. And the funny thing, you can also stir up debate. We just reposted a piece we did about 10 years ago on the earliest Christmas tree, because there are several different claims to that across Northern Europe. And after about a day, someone emailed me to tell me they had written an article to debunk one of the places, Freiburg, Germany, their claim to having the earliest Christmas tree. And I was amused to see this long article taking down one of the city's claims to a 15th century Christmas tree. So there's still quite a lot of interest. So I'm very happy to introduce the first couple of speakers here, and I will begin with Elisa Maldi. She works at the National Museum of Ravenna, where her work really focuses on iconography and local history. And today she's going to be talking to us about the adoration of the Magi.
Thank you. Thank you to the Orthodox Academy of Crete, to the medievalist.net, After Constantine Journal, Zoe and Peter for having me. So together we will speak today about Arte Ravenna and the adoration of the Magi, of the wise men here represented. Now I try to share my screen. And maybe we can start. Okay, so the adoration of the Magi, as in Matthew 2.114, was among the most popular narratives depicted in early Christian iconography of the 3rd and 4th centuries, even above the Nativity episode itself, because this first Epiphany also contained the narrative of the mystery of the incarnation of the Word in the birth of the Savior. Already present in the catacombs, as we will see with Professor Yulianov, the adoration of the Magi experienced iconography favor when liturgical prominence began to be given to celebration dedicated to the incarnation of the Verb in the Constantine age, especially in Roman Christian funerary art, for reasons that are still debated. The adoration of the wise man is in fact found on 4th century sarcophagi in Rome, where it is often depicted above the lid in a smaller form than the other scenes. Proposed for the devotion of the faithful, this secondary event of the Nativity, with the Virgin Mary on a throne holding the infant Jesus and the receiving the wise men from the east, was intended to emphasize different themes, such as the regality of Christ, Mary's role as the bearer of salvation, and redemption, open to the pagans, encountering and experiencing the divine through the love and the tenderness of a child. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the adoration is presented in most disparate media and scales in a composition usually modeled on a pattern already common in Roman art, used to depict conquered Eastern people, subjugated, that bring gifts to the victorious ruler. The Magi are always dressed in the Oriental manner, and they advance carrying, normally on a plate, the incense beads, the golden crown, and myrrh, toward the infant Jesus, who holds out his hand to them. And this crystallized imperial iconography grew by incorporating other suggestions from the Matthew Gospel as well as from other texts, such as apocryphal infancy gospel, along with sermons that echoed deep theological readings, or perhaps even liturgical communities tradition that stage or perform the adoration. Mentioning the sermons, we have to remember Peter Chrysologus, who was bishop in Ravenna during the period in which the town was the capital of the western part of the Roman Empire, and precisely during the regency of Galla Placidia. And the two of them died in the same year, 450. Peter is known as the doctor of homilies, and the wise men are mentioned in more than one of his concise but theological rich reflection, read and passed on in the Church of Ravenna for centuries. Peter connected the traditional theme of the birth of Jesus and the visit of the Magi with the baptism and Jesus' first sign at the marriage in Cana of Galilee, a third event that was a traditional part of the Epiphany celebration. In Ravenna, maybe also on the influence of these homilies, the adoration of the Magi seemed to have been very popular. It is the gospel episode that occurs the most in the surviving monuments, in mosaics, in marble sarcophagi, and in reliquary. Other medium and form were involved that are no more visible in town. For example, carved ivory bookbinding that today is in Milan, or an embroidered silk cover, which is lost forever. And hopefully other objects are way to be put in light, as the recently rediscovered small silver ring of the National Museum of Ravenna. The oldest extant representation in Ravenna art are dated to the mid-5th century. The first here presented is a very rare capsella called of Quirico e Giulitta. It came from the Church of San Giovanni Battista and is exhibited in the Archiepiscopal Museum in Ravenna. The capsella, rectangular in shape, measured 20.5 centimeters in height, 38 in wide, and 51 centimeters in long. It is decorated on the all four sides with images, very rich in detail, set in a molded frame and rendered in raw relief. Grooves for housing the sliding lid are still visible along the inner edges. To my knowledge, this is the only stone relic casket decorated with figures. Other 4th and 5th century examples of relic containers are in more noble materials, namely silver or ivory. On one of the long side is depicted the adoration of the Magi from the left. Baby Jesus is nude, stand on his mother's lap. Mary is clad in a broad cloak, partially covering her head, and she sits in profile on a wicker throne. Mary seems to offer Christ child holding out her arms, while he is receiving in outstretched hands the gifts from the wise men, proceeding to the right, advancing in a single file. The three of them have a plate, omissorium, with different shapes inside, indicating the offering of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. All three wear Phrygian caps, tunics, or chiton, chlamys, and anaxaridis. Here, as in all the other depictions in Ravenna art, the Magi advance on foot and no background is suggested. Another marble depiction of the 5th century presents the three wise men. It is a sarcophagus reused in the 7th century as tomb for an exarch, Isacius, and is nowadays in San Vitale Church. The sarcophagus presents other scenes from the Bible, as the resurrection of Lazarus and Daniel in the lion's den, but the scene of the adoration is the richest. The three wise men are dressed with broad mantle, cap, and soft boots. Mary is all wrapped in her tunic and palla and stand with the leg crossed in a highly unusual jumpsuit. Behind her head, a 6-point star is leading the Magi at the child, and Jesus is stretching a huge hand to welcome the gift, brought inside deep bowls. Another unusual detail in the position of the second Magus, looking back over his shoulder toward the third man. The drawing up is from Ang, which visited Ravenna. 50 years ago, Wolfgang Vollbach noted a detail present in other adoration made in Ravenna. For instance, the ivory book binding held in the cathedral treasury of Milan, which is a product of Ravenna Atelier, called the 5-diptych ivory. In the back half, the adoration of the Magi is depicted with synthetic elegance, and the second wise man is depicted vividly looking backwards, as to encourage or hurry his companion or announce him that the longed for destination is finally reached. This detail, for which no true explanation is known to me, is found elsewhere in several depictions over a discrete chronological span. The oldest is on the left side of the sarcophagus of Catervius, and of the 4th or beginning of the 5th century in Tolentino. In the gold medallion of the British Museum, dates 6th or 7th century, we have seen before, and on other early Middle Ages ivory, such as the Warden at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. About ivory, speaking about ivory, the most famous ivory object in Ravenna is the throne of the Bishop Maximianus, which was not crafted in Ravenna, but probably in Constantinople, and from which the representation of the Magi is sadly missing. Have to be near the Annunciation here. The well-known representation of the Magi in Ravenna mosaics in Santa Apollinare Nuovo, the only surviving building among those under Theodoric's patronage, that was founded as an Arian court church, late 5th or early 6th century, and dedicated to Christ, and then reconsecrated to the Orthodox cult by Archbishop Agnellus after Justinian edict in 561. The basilica has 3 naves, and the preserved mosaics decoration take place on the walls of the nave. They date back to the time of the Gothic king, apart from some purges carried out under Justinian, and notably the theory of martyr and virgins. Leading the procession of female saints are the 3 Magi walking toward the enthroned Virgin and Child. which is part of the original mosaic installation and the oldest monumental image of the Virgin. But part of these mosaics has been damaged over the centuries. And the drawing by Giovanni Ciampini from the 1690s show the restored head of the Magi with the crown on top. The painstaking study and restoration work undertaken by Corrado Ricci at the beginning of the 20th century led to the production of the thematic tables for restoration chronologies, the Tavole Storiche, a milestone in the history of studies of ancient wall mosaics that is still valid today. And here we can see through the colors which parts are original and where are the restoration. And here we can see that the upper part of the body of the Magi was ruined and rebuilt following the test of time. The crowns were placed, but then removed in the 20th century restoration. For the mosaics of Santa Apollinare Nuovo, for the Magi in Santa Apollinare Nuovo, we have another precious source. The colors of the garments worn by the Magi were reported between 830 and 846 by Agnellus of Ravenna in his Liber Pontificalis Ecclesiae Ravennatis, a work that is the main source for the city in late antiquity and early Middle Ages. Andreas Agnellus explained the significance, but it is unknown how old and widespread this tradition was, and no traces of their survival in more recent time are attested in Ravenna. So according to Agnellus, Caspar carries gold for regal wealth, and his reddish garment signifies marriage. Balthazar offered frankincense, priesthood, and his yellow costume signifies virginity, while Melchior, who brings myrrh, symbol of death, is dressed in a multicolored garment that signifies penitence. And Agnellus adds that the meaning of the purple cloak is that the king was born and suffered. The cloak of various colors means that Christ has taken our infirmities upon himself, and the white mantle signifies that he, in his divine splendor, is in the resurrection, leaving us a little confused as to the precise order in his depiction. The same Agnellus informed us that the bishop of the 6th century, also named Agnellus, ordered to complete an embroidered byssus cloth wanted by his predecessor, Archbishop Maximianus, and decorated with the story of the Magi, magnificently depicted. Can we presume that the color code on it was the same? We don't know because the altar cloth is disappeared. This one is a modern one, recently gifted to the Basilica of San Vitale. Another mosaic presentation of the Magi is indeed in the Church of San Vitale, consecrated a few years after the Byzantine conquest of Ravenna. The whole iconographic program is centered on the theme of the Eucharistic offering and sacrifice for the redemption of man. In the apsidal space, a little lower than the manifestation of the heavenly and divine court, the two panels representing the earthly court are proposed. The Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora with their retinue are depicted with a vivid sense of details and color as they present gift for the service of the divine liturgy. The gesture of the offering is amplified and living in the detail embroidered in gold tessera on the edge of Theodora clock. The Magi, in their traditional robe, advance at a big space. The theme of regality of the imperial couple as earthly servant of the King of Kings reflects in the panel. Last but not least, we found the wise men in Ravenna art in a small bezel of a rotating ring is a silver octagon from the 6th century with a depiction of the adoration on one side and of the Ascension on the other. Even in the minuscule proportion of the object, we can appreciate the description. So the bezel was part of a rotating ring, and I present here an example with another iconography. Even in the minuscule proportion of the object of Ravenna, we can appreciate the description. The Virgin is shown frontally, a face surrounded by the veil, which is an incised line, and she's seated according to the usual iconography. Her feet and arm barely protrude from the robe that covers her, and she supports the child who is sitting on her lap. Jesus has his head surrounded by an incised line, which represents the halo. He wears a richly pleated V-neck tunic and extends his arm and hands toward the advancing Magi. The 3 wise men, wearing oriental trousers and short tunic, proceed toward the throne with a gift at breast height. To depict the Phrygian cap, a small circle has been added to the engraved line above the head with a punch in the metal. This detail gives the impression that the 2nd wise man is facing the 3rd, and their legs are intertwined. I hope this presentation interested you, and we express, as the National Museum of Ravenna, the pleasure to have presented to a wide public our art, and like the 3 wise men, we hope to bring joy and go to the child which is born for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. We'll save questions until the end of the session. And so that brings us to our second speaker, Oleg Ulyanov, of the professor at the Russian Academy of Art. And he will be taking us to the catacombs of Rome. Go ahead.
Great to see you, dear colleagues. Many thanks for this kind invitation to such important conference. Now the Advent is going on, and in my opinion, it is quite appropriate to refer to such a rarity as gifts, especially in anticipation of Christmas. I try to demonstrate my... Okay. Is it okay? My paper is devoted to the oldest image of the Mother of God on a fresco of the first half of 3rd century in the Roman catacombs of St. Priscilla. In early Christian liturgical and topographical sources, this tomb is referred to as Lady of Catacombs, due to the burials of 7 Roman popes located in it, including the cubiculum of St. Marcellinus and his successor, Pope 6 successors, Pope Marcellinus I, which they themselves founded as reported by Liber Pontificalis. The family area for Christian burials on Via Sararia was provided by Matron Priscilla from the noble Roman family Assius Glabriella, under whom the reconstruction of the catacombs was carried out with the blessing of a Roman pontific. According to modern data, the appearance of the catacombs of St. Priscilla should be dated to the 2nd century. The fresco we are interested in is located above the entrance to one of crypts in the oldest part of the catacombs, which serves as one of the arguments in favor of such an early date. On the right side of the composition is the Mother of God, breasting feeding the divine infant, in front of whom stands on the left side a prophet with an upraised right hand extended to the star, but in the middle of them. Already the Russian scientist Nikodem Kondakov noted significant losses, primarily the entire lower half of the composition, during his examination of this fresco in 1906. However, the stylistic features of the image were quite accurately recorded in a watercolor copy of Fedor Riemann made in 1889. You can see the previous photos of the middle of 19th century before water copy of Riemann, and now this famous watercolor. You see that Fedor Riemann became many famous in Rome, as he tried to copy ancient frescoes during 12 years. It's a legend painter in darkness, catacombs only with oil lamp. The watercolor copy was intended for volume 5th of the Roma Sotterranea Christiana by Giovanni de Rossi, which is not published. Of the 130 copies of catacomb frescoes made by Fedor Riemann, 130 watercolors are from collection of State Museum of Fine Arts, Pushkin, presented in the spring exhibition of Millennium. Thanks to these sources, as well as materials from our field study of catacombs fresco in 1996, it was possible to partially reconstruct the original scheme. First of all, it should be noted that the outer garment of the Mother of God is the pallium, as is clearly visible from the left arm bare to the shoulder, and not the dalmatic, which has become widespread in various images of the Virgin Mary since the 3rd century. The right hand of the Mother of God supports the head of infant God, with the two moved away from the palm for greater stability. The gesture of the prophet, who has a crow in each hand, also has a certain meaning, while his right hand is also bare to the shoulder, as if balancing the integral symmetry of the composition. The same task dictated the location exactly on the transverse axis of the star, maybe 8-pointed, about which scientific controversy intensified in connection with the millennium anniversary of the Nativity of Christ. Unfortunately, until now, due attention has not been paid to the patterns of the location of a fresco on the south and west sail of the vault in the arcosolium, as a result of which the stars show moving from the east. According to patristic interpretation, St. John Chrysostom, Blessed Theophylact, etc., the star moved south to Jerusalem, where it pointed to a manger and stood over the head of child. By Blessed Theophylact said, the star couldn't clearly point to Christ if it had not descended down and stopped over the head of the child. St. Basil the Great, in a word for the Nativity of Christ, attributed the prophecy of Balaam only to the Gilgin staff of the Magi. The figure of a young man with an upraised right hand extended to the star above in the middle of the fresco also deserves special attention. The interpretation of this image is helped by the eschatological writings by St. Hippolytus of Rome, which testify in favor of the image of St. John the Baptist on this fresco. You see? This one. Okay. Excuse me. Indeed, in a number of medieval compositions, we can see the image of St. John the Baptist, but such an iconographical feature has not been yet traced on early Christian monuments. The meaning of the image of the Baptist in apostolic times can be judged by the logic of the gospel sites. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been taken by force, and those who use force take it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied before John, Matthew 11. In this case, the Baptist is seen as the initiator of our new year of salvation, as evidenced by the possession of the Spirit, which is inherent in the messenger of God, more than a prophet, also from Matthew. The eschatological meaning of this characteristic undoubtedly indicates that the time has come for fulfillment of prophecies and the beginning of salvation. In the fresco from the cathedral of San Priscilla, the figure of Baptist is distinguished by 2 scrolls in his hands and a hermitage throne over his left hand, which often present an early Christian image of the apostles. For example, in the mosaic of 350 of the Church of Santa Constanta in Rome. Moreover, in the last of in work on Christ and Antichrist by St. Hippolytus of Rome, especially singles out John the Baptist, who said, told everyone about the heavenly light that appeared in the world. It should be noted that St. Hippolytus of Rome owns the denunciation of all heresies where the teaching of the Docetus, who affirmed the illusory nature of God mind, is refuted. An important circumstance for our topic is also in Rome at the time the presence of the Phrygian sect Montan, whose supporters posed as new prophets, which forced St. Hippolytus of Rome to undertake efforts to expose them. Therefore, it is hardly justified to interpret the beardless young man standing before the Mother of God in this fresco is a prophet. Such features allow us to more justifiable consider the opinion about the Christmas theme of this composition. This opinion is based on the interpretation of the Old Testament prophecy of Balaam, cited, I see him, but now not yet. I see him, but not close. A star rises from Jacob, and a road rises from Israel. St. Justin the philosopher, who founded a Christian school in Rome under Emperor Anthony Pius, in his essay Conversation with Tryphon the Jew, relates this prophecy to God's definition of the human birth of the Son of God from the Virgin. Said, he like a star is about to shine from the family of Abraham. Then Moses showed that in the words a star will rise from Jacob and the leader from Israel. So when at his birth a star appeared in the sky, as it written in the memorial records of his apostles. An apology, the first, St. Justin, the same prophecy is combined with the prophecy of Isaiah, said, Isaiah, another prophet, prophesying the same thing in other words said, a star will shine from Jacob, and a flower will rise from the root of Jesse, and all nations will trust in his hand. Of particular interest to our topic is St. Justin's conversation with Tryphon the Jew, the use of such rare apocryphal source as the first Gospel of James, created by the Copts in Egypt in middle of 2nd century. It is in the first Gospel of James that there is earliest mention of the Bethlehem cave, on which St. Justin relied in the theological polemics, cites, and a strong white stone in the cave, so that they could not bury it. And after a short time, the light went away, and the child appeared, came out of the body, and took the breast sick of his mother of Mary. Somewhat later, at the end of 240, the significance of the Bethlehem cave will be defended by Origen in his work Contra Celsium. It is noteworthy that the cave of the Holy Family in the Assumption Coptic monastery is known precisely in the Coptic tradition. Visit O'Hara in the middle 19th century, Bishop Porphyrios Pensky testified that Coptic Christian show in the same city the refuge of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus, namely a cave in the Assumption Church in the monastery. You can see such unique fresco. Such ancient tradition predetermined the appearance among the Copts of the earliest image of Mother of God of Mammal, Galactophreusa, on the frescoes of the monastery of Upper Jeremiah in Sakar. You can see this fresco, and the monastery of Upper Opol in Bauita, discovered as a result of excavation by the French Archaeological Institute in 1906. A very characteristic feature of this image is that the infant God is presented at the age of 4 years, probably due to Coptic legend about his miracles growth. I can try to discuss some works. Epiphany of Cyprus, in his work De Vitas Prophetarum, where reproduced an early legend that from prophecy of Jeremiah, it became the custom for the Egyptian to beget to depict the Virgin resting on a bed. It's Epiphany of Kypros. Of utmost importance is the topography of these frescoes, which is strike accordance with the Coptic monastic tradition, are placed in characteristic niche arcosolia, specially designed for this purpose. In this case, a close analogy is provided by the imperial niche concha, known as early Christian monuments, which Alfred defined as niche of glorification. In the light of these arguments, it seems more legitimate to date the appearance of the image of Our Lady Mama of God on the frescoes Katom Sampaprishiva to the time of the pontificate of Pope St. Victor I, who was originally from Roman Africa, according to Liber Pontificalis. During his pontificate, there was a dispute about the day of Easter celebration, where the majority of Christian communities spoke in favor of a Roman practice. This calendar question required an analysis of the evidence about the celebration of Nativity of Christ, which is confirmed by the presentation of polemics on this topic by Clement of Alexandria. The existence, for compare the more later painting by Leonardo, famous, who found this fresco in Catacomb San Priscilla, we can see the same feature. The existence of tradition of veneration of the Nativity of Christ in early Christian Rome can be concluded from a number of sources, such as the chronological canon of 303 by Eusebius of Caesarea, the Roman sarcophagus created under Priestes and Romulus in 333, the Roman calendar Philocaria of 354, etc. The mention of Tonsure of Marcellina as noon by Pope Liberius in the Cathedral of St. Peter on the feast of the Nativity of Christ is consistent with this date. The letter of Archbishop John of Nicaea to Zachariah, Catholicos of Great Armenia, indicates that the Roman custom of celebrating the Nativity of Christ on December 25 under Pope Julius I passed into the practice of other communities. At the time we indicated, the outstanding theological Synod of Rome specially dealt with the date of the Nativity of Christ, even to the point of clarifying even the day of the week, and devoted many pages to this issue in his writings. In a letter from Bishop Cyril I of Jerusalem to Pope Julius, there is an indication of a local difficulty of celebrating Epiphany. It cites, it is impossible to go to Bethlehem and the Jordan at the same time. The Jerusalem Church first separated the celebration of Nativity of Christ from Epiphany and established this celebration on December 25 under Patriarch Juvenal in the middle of 5th century. This was reported in more detail in our book, devoted to Constantine and the establishment of Nativity of Christ. The earliest image of Christ contain also many images of the three wise men who present their gifts to Mother of God. You can see this earliest image also from Catacomb of Priscilla. The adoration of Magi, or adoration of kings, is the name traditionally given to the subject in the Nativity of Jesus, in art in which the three Magi represent as king, especially in the West, having found Jesus by following a star, lay before him gifts of gold, frankness, and myrrh, and worship him. It is related in the Bible by Matthew the 2, Christian iconography considerably expanded the bare account of the biblical Magi described in the Gospel of Matthew. Second, by the later Middle Ages, these drew from non-canonical sources like the Golden Legend by Jacob's Voragii. Artists used the expanded Christian iconography to reinforce the idea that Jesus was recognized from his earliest infancy as king of the earth. The adoration scene was often used to represent the nativity, one of the most indispensable episodes in the cycles of the life of the Virgin as well as the life of Christ. You can see this the same relief from Pio Christiani Museum, as my colleague shows, and for 14th century large retranis are often shown, and the gifts are contained in spectral pieces, you can see, of goldsmith work, San Maria in Trastevere, Rome. Among the innumerable treasures and holy relics preserved at the Holy Monastery of St. Paul at Mount Athos, opening Holy Mountain, the most precise and invaluable to Greek Orthodoxy are these holy gifts that believed to have been offered by the free magi of the East to the newborn Jesus. The gifts of the magi is a world famous work of jewelry. Of these gifts of gold is in form of 28 carved flat tiles of various shapes, rectangular, trapezoidal, polygonal, etc., which are about 5 cm and 7 cm in size. Each tile has a different artistic design. You can see some various. Since the spiritual, material, historic, and archaeological value of the holy gifts is incalculable, they are carefully guarded in the treasure of this monastery, Athos Monastery. But the authenticity of the gifts of the Magi is partly based only on oral tradition and the rest on history. However, no scientific attribution of this monument of a cultural heritage has been undertaken to the present time. This work for the first time in world science shed light on the origin and dating of the gifts of the Magi based on proven methods of scientific attribution. I do with some remember about the first description about these gifts of Magi as a book of Pilgrim by Archbishop Antony from Novgorod, who can see in the church of St. Sophia in 102 centuries, no gifts of Magi, but only indicates that in St. Sophia, in the altar, the gift-bearing vessels of gold who brought Christ. You can see this side. The same vessels apparently are also mentioned in the description of Constantinople in the 11th century. Tarragona Anonymous, created between 1075 and 1098. Image of such golden vessels in the hands of Magi were widely known in the medieval Europe. For example, you can see the reliefs of the runic Franks casket of the early 8th century from a British museum. Another, more detailed, only vessels of gold, not any gift, and also capital of the Cathedral of St. Lazarus in autumn, made by sculptor Gisbertus 1120. Only in the 18th century, Russian traveler Grigorovich Barsky, who visited Mount Athos in November 1744, left the first historical evidence of the gift of Magi at the monastery of St. Paul. You can see only in 8th century he described some golden belt, not this one, about 6 cm wide. Such golden belts of Byzantine emperors were known to emphasize their high rank of insignia, but as already noted, none of historical sources contains no information about the liturgical tradition of wearing a golden belt from the gift of Magi on the Lord's holiday in St. Sophia. According to surviving historical sources, it was possible to establish an exact periodization in the history of the gifts of Magi from monastery of St. Paul. The first, in the 12th century, gifting golden vessels which they brought to Christ were kept in the capital of Byzantine Empire and the sacristy of St. Sophia, Constantinople. You can see my investigation of this gift during my study at Mount Athos. This varies. And the second step, second stage, in 1470, the wife of Ottoman Sultan Murat II, Mara Branković, the daughter of the Serbian despot Gregory Branković and Irina Cantacuzina, brought gifting golden vessels, which were brought to Christ as a gift to the Serbian monastery of St. Paul on Athos, as stated by the Turkish Firman, lost during the fire on 1902. This third stage, in the 6th, 7th centuries, gifting golden vessels, which brought gifts to Christ, were converted into golden belt, numbering 9 gold plates and 69 beads from a mixture of inks and myrrh. The fourth stage, after 1744, when the monastery of St. Paul were again inhabited by monastic brethren, the number of plates increased to 24 and the beads decreased by 7. Finally, the gift of Magi from the sacristy of monastery of St. Paul offers other work of jewelry out of post-Byzantine period of the 6th century, 17th century. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oleg, and thank you to both our speakers. We have a little time for questions before we take a 5-minute break. So if you have any, could you leave your hand or leave a comment in the chat. And I'll just begin, and I have a question for both our speakers. And like, so basically, the images you both talk about are like among the most popular themes that come up like in medieval art. Why do you think that the kind of theme of the Magi is so depicted so often, even compared with other kind of Christian themes? Oh, you'll need to unmute.
In some interruptions with sound, many weak connection. You asked me about depict the Mary.
I noticed, like, yeah, you both had like Jesus and Mary is one theme that's really well done. Also, it's really prominent, as well as the Magi itself. So, there's just kind of thoughts on why those two particular kind of themes are so prominent.
Yes, you can see one can see some evidence for the importance of this theme in the early Christian texts, as I quote by St. Hippolytus of Rome. You can see, and we know some discussion on this theme in the middle of 2nd century, according to the Liber Pontificalis. All this discussion take place in Rome. And just after this, so you can see some impact exactly of Rome traditions in this theme to when widespread across all the Christian world from Rome. But this theme is exactly with Galactrophusa, Mother of Mammon, is closely connection with Coptic tradition. It's very interesting. When Roman Pope, origin from from East, from Christian East, from in Egypt, some tradition from Christian East with venerable of Mother of God among the Copts, also widespread in Rome in the 2nd century. And the very best example is this fresco, the ancient. You can see only in catacomb of St. Priscilla we have the ancient images, fresco with Mother of God, Mammon, Galactrophusa, and 3 Magi is the earliest images of such theme. In St. Priscilla, with all we know about these catacombs.
Alexa, do you have anything to add, or? No, okay. I think thank you so much. We'll take about a 5-minute break and reconvene with the remaining speakers.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Let's give it a minute for everyone to show up. Okay, I think we're good to go. Let's move on to our second session for today's conference. And we will start with Reverend Gabriel Pistea from Romania, who will present us a topic on popular traditions on the Feast of Baptism of the Lord in Romania, how they were assimilated and shaped in the Church. So, Reverend Pistea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in your great conference. I would like to send my congratulations for your organizing and all the work you do. We are moving on from the Christmas feast to the baptismal feast now. As you know, in the past, these two feasts were celebrated together. And therefore, I will speak about the popular tradition on the Feast of Baptism of the Lord in Romanian. I have a presentation. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. In this presentation, I will analyze the ethnographic elements inserted in the popular memory of Romanian people, and not only, held on the occasion of the Epiphany, referring in particular to the Epiphany service. First of all, I will enter into the world of the carols dedicated to this act of the Savior, and I will analyze their themes. I will then look at the customs or traditions that include the two essential elements of the service of Epiphany, the cross and the basil. In the third part, I will look at the meaning of the great sanctification of water from an ethnographic point of view, and at the popular custom that take place on this occasion. In the last section, I will present the main folk customs in our country that are celebrated on the Feast of Epiphany, and I will speak about the custom names Chiraleisa. First, carols dedicate the Feast of Epiphany. Since the Feast of Epiphany has long been celebrated together with the Feast of the Nativity, the custom of caroling has spread throughout the period from 24th of December to 6th of January. Thus, in the tradition of the Christian peoples, there are many carols on the theme of the baptism of the Lord in Jordan. Their text doesn't follow the biblical episode of the event from Jordan, but rather presents the actual practice of baptism, portraying Jesus as a baby brought to baptism by his mother. The carol verses extend the event of the Nativity. In the caroling tradition from the Romanian region of Muntenia, the Mother of God, together with the child, climbs a mountain. They are followed by Saint John, who leads them to a place where three rivers flow, one of water, one of milk, and one of myrrh. The text of these carols, despite the biblical event, has influenced the iconographic tradition. In many icons, Jesus is depicted as a child at the moment of his baptism. In one depiction of the icon of the Nativity of the Lord, the Holy Infant's bath is depicted with two women pouring water into the font where the Lord is, highlighting both the Nativity and the act of baptism. Popular traditions give other connotations to the biblical event and to the iconographic program, from which, however, it is largely inspired. The three rivers represent the initiation of the child, referring to the three sacraments of initiation into the church. The element of milk was present in the Western ritual of the sacrament of baptism, as St. Ambrose of Milan presents it to us. The text of the carols suggests on the one hand, that Jesus received a name and is consecrated, and on the other hand, it shows us that through the element of water, myrrh and milk, the material is sanctified because the divine child has entered into them. Also, from the text of the carols for Epiphany, we get the idea that the infant Jesus also had a godfather at his baptism, namely Saint John the Baptist. This role of the Savior's godfather is widespread not only in the Balkan folklore, but also in other areas such as southern Italy and Corsica. The Baptist hears his role as godfather of the Lord following a meeting of the saints, to which he appears on a beautiful horse. He acquires this status by being the oldest of them all. The text of the carol overturns the values, placing John as greater than God. A carol from Northern Macedonia depicts the Lord after his baptism, kneeling before John. The custom of caroling at Epiphany is relatively new. The first references are found in Moldova and northern Bukovina, from where we get Epiphany songs from the 20th century. Karaman, a researcher from Romania, tells us that the custom of caroling at Epiphany is also in the tradition of the Greek people and other peoples of Eastern Europe. From the Hellenic area, we know we have the carol of the Feast of Light, entitled Σήμερα τα φώτα. Holy Cross and Basil, traditional elements of the Feast of Epiphany. The most important elements of the Epiphany service are the Holy Cross and the Basil. These have taken on many connotations in the Romanian popular tradition. We know the custom of making ice crosses, which are placed on the day of the Epiphany around the place where the great water sanctification takes place. If this occurs at flowing water, especially large rivers or the Black Sea, it is customary for the officiant to throw a cross into the water and the young people swim towards it. The one who catches it first is blessed with health and help from God all year. If the great sanctification of the water was celebrated at the river, the thrown cross was caught by a child, who then walked with the priest to people's houses, carrying with him the cross caught in the river. The making of ice crosses is documented in the 19th century. Regarding the basil, an ethnographic tradition tells us that the people who participate in the baptism of the Lord brought with him basil, with which they convert Christ. Thus, the basil remained in the church, and the priest consecrated the water with it. To this respect, testimonies of the peasants received from their ancestors tell us that the Lord received the name of Christ at the baptism, and until then he was called Basil, which from the Latin word basilicum and the Russian word basiliok translate as basil. Another tradition tells us that the basil flower helped Saint Helena to find the Lord's cross. Basil grew on the spot where the cross was hidden, indicating its presence. From this, we can see the resemblance, almost to the point of identification, according to the elders, of the cross with the basil, without which the water cannot be made holy. In some part of our country, basil has acquired a magical practice. Unmarried girls taking from the basil that the priest brings to each person's house with the traditional Epiphany visit, and placing it on their bedside on Epiphany Eve, hoping that they will dream of their sweethearts. In other areas, unmarried girls pluck basil threads from the priest's sprigs. They are careful to see where the priest first steps into the house and take earth from the spot. Some put the basil threads dipped in the holy water and the earth under their pillow, and others make their bed and go to sleep right where the priest first stepped when he entered the house. The great sanctification of water, the great popular customs, the highlight of the Feast of Epiphany is the great sanctification of water, which give birth to the great holy water. This moment has gained over time in Romanian villages remarkable popular significance. The Epiphany represents, in the old tradition and customs, the moment when heaven opens and everything is sanctified, the poor man having the opportunity to talk to God on the night on the Epiphany. Anyone who keeps vigil on this night will be healthy and no evil will touch him. This supernatural atmosphere of the union of heaven and earth highlights the spiritual church of this moment when all the creation is sanctified and renewed. The earth tastes the heavenly fragrance through the holy water. Everything is purified through baptism. The ethnographer Simeon Florea Marian give us details about the preparation of the place where the consecration of the water will take place, as well as typical roles about what is chanted at the service. Beside the hymnography in the books of worship, he says that in some areas, other poems with religious themes are also sung. He also describes the crowd of people after the consecration of the waters when they flocked to take from the holy water, showing an impatience with the healing power of this miraculous water. The purpose of the hostel is that whoever takes first of the holy water will be healthier and the others, because the first water is purer and then the one who takes last. This belief being handed down from the ancestors. On the screen, we have a text, a testimony of Archdiacon Paul of Aleppo, who, following a visit to Moldavia in the Valachia with the Patriarch Macarius of Antioch in 17th century, record this. And I will read some phrases. This happens at the courts of the greatest princes of Christianity. After the prayers over the water, the clergyman takes the crosses in their hands and go first to the palace of the landlord. Then they go to the local metropolitan. We go out of the church so that the patriarch can sink the cross in the river. The procession was formed first by the stewards, 2 by 2. You can see in the image, with their symbols and flags with crosses on top, then those with torches, then the priest, 2 by 2, finally the patriarch with the metropolitan. When go there, he found the water frozen, for the morning was freezing cold, and he said us that this time the prayer was made inside the palace. Now the people had broken the ice, and the patriarch flung the cross into the water 3 times. The priest immersed a great number of children, some of who froze. It pained us to hear the cries of the children suffering from the ice and cold. On the landlord kissed the cross, a sign was given to the troops, and they discharged their muskets, thundering through the air. And the Paul of Aleppo said us that let it be noted that all the great mountain landlords are beyond religious. The last chapel, various popular customs connected with Epiphany. The last part of this study will be dedicated to the presentation of some popular customs related to Epiphany, which bear certain names. I will only mention in my presentation the tradition of the priest going around people's house on Epiphany Eve, common in all Romanian areas. This custom is also known as working with the chiraleisa, from the Greek expression Kyrie eleison. In some area, a group of boys would surround houses or stables, ringing bells and shouting kiraleisa, or good fruits, with the connotation of a magical agriculture cult. The visit of the priest with the holy water gives rise to many popular traditions, giving the moment a sacred connotation, both through the presence of the priest and through the object he carries to sanctify the house: the cross, the great holy water, and the basil. In folk tradition, it is said that Adam had written the souls of men on a piece of paper, which he gave to the devil, and the devil put in the water under a stone, holding all men captive from Adam. God sent Saint Nicholas to hell to ask to devil who could remove the marks on the paper, and the devil told him that only that man who would be born of a virgin and be baptized. This happened through the person of the Savior. At the time of the baptism, he realized 3 candles into the water, which went and burned the devil's paper, and thus the souls of men were set free. The devil, thinking that he would catch the Lord when he came to hell, made a chain chair, on which, however, he ended up sitting. Throughout the year, the chair's chains are loosened, but when the priest comes and shouts the kiraleisa at people's houses at Epiphany, the chains are strengthened again. And some conclusion: popular tradition related to the feast of the baptism of the Lord are very rich in the area of Romanian, and they are inherited from our ancestors. Having become so much a part of people's consciousness, sometimes they have been given a greater meaning than the Epiphany service itself. This is why folk traditions tend to be given greater importance than the main elements of the celebration. Some traditions have also found their way into the church public worship on the occasion of the Feast of Epiphany, so much that in traditional Romanian villages they can generate serious disputes between priests and some believers who tend to emphasize these traditions and impose them to the detriment of the authentic spiritual experience of the redemptive event being celebrated. In other cases, the Church has assimilated some popular traditions of pagan origin, succeeding in making them Christian and giving them a meaning in accordance with its doctrine. At times, the struggle of the ministrants through the process of catechesis is to give the faithful the correct doctrinal meaning of the feast and to enlighten them regarding some popular tradition and their secondary role in the celebrant event. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Reverend Pistea, for this very interesting and insightful presentation. Thank you. Now we move on to Dr. Linda Vogt-Turner from Intercontinental University, who will present us a topic about the Nativity, the Bible, and ecumenism. So Linda, we're all ears for you.
Okay, now I am going to try and share my screen, and I thank you for this opportunity, but I won't take up the time with all of this because my presentation is long, so I'll just get started. My desktop, share sound, and here we go. Now, can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Recent cave pictures found in Egypt suggest the Nativity is a 5,000-year-old ascension ritual celebrating the birth of a child. So does the Nativity, the birth of Jesus, come out of pagan beliefs and Hebrew beliefs celebrating marriage and the raising of a newborn family to heavenly maturity? I believe so. Here's why. If one connects Acts 14:12 with bits and pieces from the 4 Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, the Pauline letters, and certain passages of the Hebrew Testament, with the Hebrew story of Ruth, the evidence becomes clear. The 4 Gospels were written after the Pauline letters and the Acts of the Apostles. The word barn in Old English comes from the word barley house. And so keep this Old English word in mind as you read Acts 14:12. Paul and Joseph, called Barnabas, travel together to bring the good news of Christ to the Greeks and Romans. Abba comes from the Hebrew word ab, for father. So one should be a little curious as to why Paul is traveling with a barn father. Western tradition places the nativity in a barn, although scripture merely says Mary brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Yet tradition places the nativity scene in a barn, with a manger that resembles a barn, a little hay house. And thus North American worshipers have sung Away in the Manger since 1887. An interesting but unsubstantiated side note here is that the composer claimed that Martin Luther had not only written Away in a Manger, but had sung it to his children each night before bed. So take a look at this Georgian threshing floor painting. After bundles of hay were dry, they were stored in a barn or stacked until threshing time. Barley and other cereal plants have a head of grain at the top of a long stem. After the grain is cut and dried, the stems lose their heads through the process called threshing. Evenly yoked cattle were often used to thresh the grain. The straw would have been raked up and used as bedding. Now take a look at this Chagall painting. It illustrates the Hebrew story of Ruth and Boaz. The widow Naomi, returning to Bethlehem from Moab, instructs her widowed daughter-in-law Ruth to perfume herself and go to the threshing floor before midnight and wait until Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, and he had laid down on the hay. Thus Ruth goes in secretly, silently, uncovers his feet, and lays down on the hay. At midnight, the startled Boaz turns over, and there lying at his feet is a woman. "Who are you?" he asks. "I am your servant Ruth," she says, and then boldly proposes to him, saying, "Spread the corner of your garment over me like a tent, for you are a kinsman redeemer." From this idea of how barley is threshed, one can get a better sense of the spiritual message of the manger scene in a barn. As I mentioned, the word barn in Old English comes from the word barley house. Many nativities simply depict a lean-to or a stone grotto strewn with hay, with Mary and Joseph focusing attention on the babe in the straw or hay-filled manger. With the presence of farmers, shepherds, angels, sheep, cattle, donkeys, and wise men, one can also glean the idea that these participants are necessary for the threshing of the grain required for the baking of bread in the city called Bethlehem, the house of bread. Such a nativity scene would reinforce the divine concept of Christ being born as the bread of life and as the bride who belongs to a Redeemer bridegroom, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together in Christ. There is a link between the nativity and the Hebrew story of Ruth and Boaz in Matthew. Scholars have pointed out that Mary is silent in Matthew and point out that the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream while he was sleeping and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." What Matthew hints at here is that the angel that Joseph is listening to while he, like Boaz, is sleeping and not fully awake is his bride, and she is a divine messenger. Matthew's genealogy also includes Boaz to reinforce the message that Joseph belongs to the house of David. By the way, David means beloved. In addition, Matthew records how all that was taking place was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken through the prophet Isaiah, who said, when King Ahaz refused to seek a sign for a united monarchy, a united household, Isaiah spoke up and said, "Hear now, O house of David, is it not enough to try the patience of men? Will you try the patience of my God as well? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. So Christmas pageants put the newborn king in a manger filled with hays. Historically, farmers used hays, such as barley, to preserve pasture grasses during the winter. Yet farmers provide their cattle with hay all year, and many of us people are like cattle or sheep who have gone astray. We live in cities. We have no idea that cows need hays, such as barley, to produce milk. In the story of Barnabas, the people thought Barnabas was the Greek god Zeus, who had come to life in human form. Zeus was the equivalent of the Roman god Jupiter, the king and father of their gods, and the largest planet in our solar system. In the gospel story, the wise men are believed to be astronomers who study the planets and stars and compiled almanacs for the farmer, the agronomer. Astronomy and agronomy are natural sciences, and the ancient Babylonians, Zoroastrians, Greeks, and Romans, like the Hebrews, would have incorporated natural science into their faith stories. The first farmer's almanac to appear in Europe was compiled in Spain in 1088 CE under the supervision of an Islamic astronomer. Thus, it is very likely Paul would have drawn upon natural science and the myths of the Greeks and Romans to help explain the birth of Jesus. Yet the popular use of myth has undercut the value of the wisdom contained within folktales, myths, and almanacs. Even Paul seems to refute natural science by saying the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly, foolish to him, and he is not able to understand the wisdom gleaned from them, because they are spiritually discerned. Yet Paul makes the case that the spiritual person is the born-again person. So it is important to keep in mind that the four Gospels were written after Acts 14:12, and take note how Paul and Joseph, called Barnabas, traveled together as a couple to the Greeks and Romans. The people saw Joseph as the father of the Roman god Jupiter, equivalent to Zeus, the god of thunder, who the Greeks saw as the father of their gods. So every year, Christians journey to this barn, this barley house with Mary and Joseph, who are engaged with the intention of becoming one flesh, living together in one house. The Madonna makes this divine concept known, and as her dawn grasps this concept and appears with her, he rises and becomes the father and king of their house. It's tradition. And as most marriages go, it takes time for their newborn love to mature, and it takes time and humility for them to learn how to work as a team, evenly yoked. And as a modern Greek Orthodox priest from Cumming, Georgia, in the United States recently stated, the power of tradition is that it can bear timelessness and then pass on that timelessness to the next generation. To properly embrace the power of tradition means both the humility of being taught and the willingness to actively live this tradition. As the news and testimonies of Christ's birth circulate, then as now, disagreements concerning who Christ is arise. Some say, I follow Paul, I follow Apollo, I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. So Paul wrote a letter asking, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Without seeing Paul face to face, one may assume Paul is male, because whenever anyone refers to Paul, they always say he. Now don't be fooled. In Ephesians, Paul reminds readers that a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And Paul declares in Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Don't be fooled. Know who's who. Connect Galatians 2:20 to Rabbi John's testimony and Joshua 23:8. For when the woman Jesus, called Mary, comes to the garden of the tombs looking for her dawn, her Lord, her husbandman, her Redeemer, she's in tears. The stone, the Cephas, the rock she has pinned her hope on has rolled away, and she is alone and feeling empty. Yet, as the Rabboni speaks to her, saying, do not cling to me. Go and tell my brothers, I must ascend to my Father and yours, the one belonging to you. Her tears of grief instantly, like a flash of lightning, turn to tears of joy as she remembers the testimony of the rabbi called John. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom ascends, and listens for him, and is overjoyed to hear the bridegroom's voice. Joyously, he loses his head. So the folks in Derbe and Lystra lose their heads joyously, receiving Joseph as Barnabas, who they testify as being the father of Jesus, who they claim is the God of thunder, the Father and King of the gods. Similarly, the Romans call the father of their gods Jupiter, and also claim he is the god of thunder, the father of Apollo and Mercury, the Roman equivalent to Hermes. Take note, Jupiter and Mercury are planets, yet Mercury is the smallest planet and appears as a morning and evening star, while Jupiter is the largest and appears like a great star without the aid of a telescope when it aligns very closely with Saturn every 800 years or so. The author of Acts also tells us Barnabas was born as Joseph, And in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, we are told Joseph is the bridegroom of the woman Jesus called Mary, who in Western tradition is called the Madonna. In the Gospel of Mark, James and John are called the sons of thunder. And in Exodus 19:19, when the trumpet sounded, heralding the presence of God and the giving of the law, Moses, the teacher of Israel, spoke, and God answered him with thunder. Remember how in Matthew we are told that Mary is the expectant bride and Joseph is the one who will give the child of the manger the name Jesus. And remember how the first almanac in Europe appeared in Spain in 1088. Well, Hispanic people at the time of Jesus were under Roman rule, and they would have pronounced the name Jesus as Jesus, as they still do today. As previously mentioned, disagreements as to who Christ is divide people and cause people to quarrel. Thus many then and now dismiss Acts 14:12 as blasphemy, idolatry, and madness, foolishness, nonsense. Thus, when the Ephesians pushed Alexander forward, the Greeks believe was the human incarnation of Apollo, the sun god. Many Christians think they are doing this to discredit Alexander and/or Paul. Don't let them fool you. Apollo, born in the city of Alexander, works together with Paul and Christ, the everlasting Father, to plant, water, and bring the increase collected and harvested by a cloud of witnesses down through the ages all over the world. Remember, the story of Barnabas comes before the gospel stories. The Greeks give Paul the title Hermes because they see Paul as the keynote speaker who they say has come to life in human form as the messenger of God. Traditionally, Hermes is depicted as a swift-footed male man with a purse of male letters, wearing shoes and a hat donned with winged lightning bolts. And tradition depicts Hermes as a young person who fooled Apollo, aka Alexander, and stole some of his cattle by putting shoes on their feet made from the bark of an oak. So some were all for stoning Paul, and others wanted to offer Barnabas and Hermes sacrificial gifts, as do the wise men who come and lay their sacrificial gifts down at the feet of Joseph and Mary in the gospel story. Yet Paul and Barnabas could not stop them. So Paul was stoned and left for dead. Don't be fooled. Hermes is often depicted in stone statues with balls, male genitalia, as if to say, Paul is a little gal, once called Sal, who is Christ's bride, who has balls, the spirit and the vigor to go and tell the good news. Back to the barn. What about Silas? How does he enter the story? Many barns have silos attached or underground as well as mangers. Silos store silage, and so as Joseph and his love for Mary and their spiritual family matures, he, as does Joseph in the Hebrew Testament, becomes a living silo, a Silas. To conclude, if one connects Acts 14:12 with gleanings from the four Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, the Pauline letters, and certain passages of the Hebrew Testament, the evidence mounts. The Nativity, the birth of Jesus, comes out of pagan beliefs and Hebrew beliefs, celebrating a holy wedding and the raising of a holy, born-again earthly family to heavenly maturity. Now how to stop share? Okay, there we go.
Thank you very much, Linda, for this very informative recording. That was great. That was really great. Thank you. And this brings us to our final speaker for today's conference, John J. Gallagher, who will talk about the context of Bede's Gospel homilies for Advent and Christmas. John, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Zoe. Can I confirm that you can see my screen here?
Yes, yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you all to everyone at the Journal After Constantine and the Orthodox Academy, as well as medievalist.net, for organizing today's wonderful colloquium. It's really nice that this has kind of become an annual tradition, and I'm happy to be speaking here again today. So this evening, I'm going to speak to you about Bede's homilies, a kind of corpus of kind of much overlooked texts by the Venerable Bede. Mostly today, my questions are going to concern the critical reception of the homilies, as well as the kind of, I suppose, the ideas behind the original context in which these texts were used. And then towards the end of the paper, I'll get into an exposition of how Bede specifically treats the subjects of Advent and Christmas. So let me just get set up here. Okay. So in addition to his work as an historian, calendrical scientist, and biblical scholar, the Venerable Bede was also the author of a prodigious corpus of homilies or sermons. The recent growth of critical interest in Bede's exegetical commentaries, which reflect their circumstances of production, has cemented his identity as a biblical scholar in the imagination of the historian. However, his homiletic output remains underappreciated, perhaps because of the specialized or recherché nature of homiletic studies, which tend to be more theological, less reflective of history and politics, and less colourful than Old Testament biblical commentary. The extent to which Bede's commentaries were read and used by others in his own institutional monastic context is unclear, though they certainly reflect his scholarship and teaching within the monastery. Although less well acclaimed than the commentaries, the homilies provide a more definitive window into how Bede's scriptural interpretation was heard, read, and consumed by other monastic personnel in his own time, in his own context. So in the list of works appended to his autobiographical epilogue to the Historia Ecclesiastica, Bede included Homilarium Evangelii Libros Duos, homilies on the Gospels in 2 books. Of the homilies he composed, Bede selected 50 to be included in this collection. There may originally have been more. One important point to note, Bede's homilies were written in Latin, therefore they were almost certainly aimed at monastic audiences, but in which context is the subject of today's paper. The collection was probably assembled around the year 730. Bede completed the Historia Ecclesiastica in 731, but the homilies are likely to have been a product of a longer range of time throughout his career. 12 deal with the Sundays and feast days of Advent and Christmas, but 19 in total attend to Christmas and Epiphany Tide up until the Feast of Candlemas on the 2nd of February. So the rest covered the seasons of Lent and Easter. One of Bede's most admired church fathers, Gregory the Great, composed 40 gospel homilies, and Bede's collection seems to be modelled on Gregory's, but with very little overlap in their coverage of readings. And the sole overlap is in homily 1:6 on Luke 2, which is one of Bede's homilies for Christmas. So the issue dominating the study of Bede's homilies, arguably a small area of Bede studies, is the question of their original use, which I hope today's paper will shed some light on. So it is unclear whether they were originally delivered as part of the liturgy of the Mass, perhaps when the abbot of the monastery was absent, Ceolfrith, the abbot, who commissioned Codex Amiatinus, which is the oldest single-volume Bible or Pandect that survives. This was commissioned as a gift for the Pope to be brought to Rome upon his retirement there. Ceolfrith was an enthusiastic traveller, as his Italian retirement plans tell us, as was the monastery's founder, Benedict Biscop, who was also an avid bibliophile and traveller. Use in the Mass is possible, but as Lawrence Martin has noted, the absence of references to the Eucharist within the homilies could suggest otherwise. Their use as readings, sermons, or scriptural reflections in the Liturgia Orarum, the Liturgy of the Hours, is generally thought to be the more likely context for their composition and delivery. Scholars of the homilies are keen on this use as the undergirding original purpose, but I do not find it entirely convincing. Local idiosyncratic interpretations of the rule of St. Benedict of Nursia governed the structure of monastic life in England and the West at this time. The rule was commonly mixed with other rules or codes in the early medieval period, and it's not clear to what degree Bede's own context was governed strictly by the rules of Benedict's programme, although the homilies show ample evidence of its influence. Various circumstances in monastic life under the rule could have demanded the creation or use of Bede's homilies. The rule required the private study of the scripture known as Lectio Divina to be carried out by all monastics as a form of devotion and spiritual reflection. The homilies are markedly more mystical, ruminative, and inwardly reflective than the public sermons of the Church Fathers, notwithstanding their rhetorical flavour that's been outlined successfully by John Becket. Public readings were required firstly during the meals and before the office of Compline, known as collatio, and also in the night office, often known as vigils or matins. Readings from the Old Testament, the New Testament were prescribed alongside readings by, quote, well-known and Orthodox Church Fathers. So this was an ancient and apostolic time for prayer, aimed at sanctifying the night hours before dawn, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles 16, media autem nocte Paulus et Silas orantes laudabant Deum, and at midnight Paul and Silas praying praised God. So Gregory the Great in the 6th century prescribed patristic readings, and the homilies of Leo I were also used in this way. From the 10th century onwards, the religious community held a daily chapter meeting during which a chapter was read from the Benedictine rule or the gospel of the day on Sundays and feast days, which would have been accompanied by homiletic exposition by the community's abbot or prior, quote, as the Lord inspires him. It is not clear if such a practice would have existed earlier in Bede's Northumbria in the 8th century, but if it did, it's one possible use for the homilies. Whether Bede or the abbot would have delivered it is another question. So some of the doubts remain regarding this possible context for use in the Liturgy of the Hours. If used as a form, in an early form of the chapter meeting, would the leader of the community have required a set text written by Bede? The rule specifies that the spirit should move the abbot, indicating an extemporaneous nature and placing such instruction within the remit of the community leader's duties. Secondly, would Bede have delivered the homily habitually as the chief biblical scholar in his community, as one called to be a doctor of the church? Wasn't this the abbot's duty as shepherd? And thirdly, if used as readings in the night office, would Bede himself have authored texts to be delivered in lieu of, quote, Orthodox Church Fathers? Maybe he and the texts he gained and his texts gained such a status after his own day, but it's unlikely that he put them forward in this way himself, not least because the texts contain very little quotation from the Church Fathers and consist mostly of Bede's own original exposition, weaving together of scriptural quotations and allusions, and occasionally recycling patristic ideas and interpretations. Elsewhere in the commentaries, Bede is humble about his own contributions to the patristic tradition and is careful to highlight sources, humbly demurring that he follows only, quote, in the footsteps of the fathers. While we know that this is not true and that Bede stood shoulder to shoulder with the fathers of the church, the point still stands that he would not have promoted his own scholarly work in this way. The oral delivery of a homily potentially meant that Bede didn't signal sources in the same way that he did in his commentaries, but obscuring references again is really not typical of Bede's style, especially if the night office expressly called for interpretation or readings from the Church Fathers. The homilies have been called timeless, and aside from one sermon on the famed Anglo-Saxon Benedict Biscop, founder of Bede's double monastery, they are universal, atopical, and atemporal in quality. If they were indeed ever preached live by Bede, they are recorded in a sanitized form that permits them to be used in the general and recurring cycles of the Church's primary liturgical seasons by any preacher. That almost all homilies are the exact same length strengthens the argument that the texts are the product of an overall program of design following the Romano-Neapolitan lectionary and not witnesses of occasional or piecemeal preaching. Forms of address like fratres carissimi, dearly beloved brothers, is formulaic, like similar expressions in Bede's letters, these epistolary treatises that accompany the biblical commentaries that are addressed to individuals but clearly intended for a general audience. Bede's homilies might have been composed to follow generic conventions and to resemble homilies that were delivered to communities at one point in time. Part of Bede's innovation was producing works for specific circumstances, but which were useful for wider audiences and readerships. So throughout the year, or throughout this paper, excuse me, you've kindly listened to me criticize the arguments about the original conditions in which Bede's homilies were possibly composed and used, without putting my own neck on the line too much. Truthfully, I believe that Bede was ahead of his time. Bede consciously wrote his commentaries as private acts of religious reflection to develop his own spirituality and devotion, but also for individuals who commissioned homilies, and also with a sense that they would be used more broadly. The homilies are possibly a literary program fitting this bill. He writes with a sense of location within the tradition and innovates within it, which is behind the popularity of his commentaries after his own day. Bede was ordained a deacon at 19 and a priest at the canonical age of 30. Perhaps like the great scholar and biblical translator Jerome, who never celebrated Mass, or Alcuin of Tours, who was a deacon but not a priest, Bede's vocation was primarily to the first order of the clergy, the diaconate, something which is really lost in the modern church in the West today, which favours concelebration and which undervalues the permanent diaconate and its role. Very curiously, Lawrence T. Martin, one of the editors of Bede's homilies, makes a comment in his study of Bede's preaching that completely elides or overlooks the role and ministry of the deacon. Bede would not have been indicating in this quotation that Bede would not have delivered a homily in certain circumstances, and that there's no guarantee that he did. However, as a deacon, Bede might well have felt impelled in his vocation as a deacon to produce a program that complemented existing materials and which could have been composed with either literary or practical intentions in mind. So the diaconate is the order of the teacher, preacher, and scholar in the medieval context. It is a call to minister to the mind and to the spirit, and is perhaps a more distinctive role than that of priest in the medieval church. Occasionally in his admonition of the contemporary church, Bede could be seen to have assumed the role of a bishop, but one gets the sense that Bede the deacon was his primary identity. As a deacon, he may well have preached the sermons over his long career, from 691 or 2, the year of his ordination to the diaconate, to 731, when the Historia Ecclesiastica was completed, along with his bibliography of works. In sum, Bede might have well have preached some homilies and could have authored a lot more due to necessity. They generally cover readings not covered by Gregory. Whether or not he delivered them publicly is another question. The homilies strongly reflect his practice as a biblical scholar, so it is possible that he produced texts as an academic and spiritual exercise in a similar vein. Too many questions remain regarding the formal context and opportunity for preaching by a biblical scholar in an 8th century monastery under a form of the Benedictine rule. So if you have any ideas on this front, I'd be really grateful for your help in thinking through this problem. Bede was ahead of his time, and his homilies were timeless, and it was for this reason that they became famous after his own day. The Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne commissioned Paul the Deacon of Monte Cassino to put together a formal homiliary to be read as part of the night office of vigils. Roughly 25% of the material in Paul the Deacon's homiliary is from Bede. The collection of patristic and contemporary writing was used throughout the period and remains the basis of the Roman breviary today. Although Bede's homilies are not summaries of patristic learning as such and represent his own reflective and biblical exposition, it was seen by later Carolingians as the apogee of patristic interpretations of the lectionary. Bede reflects the learning of his church, even if it isn't directly presented in this way in his homilies. One gets the sense that Bede wrote for the tradition and was conscious of it, and very soon after his own time, the tradition accepted him as a patristic authority. His homilies became reified and canonized in the office of matins and remained the mainstay of the monastic horarium for the entire medieval period. Thus, his preaching on Advent and Christmas was what generations and centuries of medieval monastics would have heard and experienced. Therefore, if we want to know what the average monk would have learned about a particular biblical reading, topic, or feast, we only have to look to Bede's homilies, which were the definitive exposition. I think Bede would have been happy to know that his works were used in this way. One interesting aside, the homily for Benedict Biscop, which is the only localizable homily in Bede's repertoire, is retained in continental revisions of the homiletic collection. where Benedict Biscop is actually recast as Benedict of Nursia, who's the author of the rule, showing recontextualization. So if you'll allow me to kind of be a little bit presentist for a moment, I think that Benedict of Nursia would have appreciated how his rule had evolved to the complexity that was the medieval divine office, and that a homily by a monk on the edge of Western Christendom under his rule or some form thereof was used for his Benedict's commemoration. For us historians of monasticism, the homilies perfectly reflect the intellectual and spiritual flourishing that life under the monastic rule engendered. So the homilies show a very strongly biblical focus. They proceed with verse-by-verse exposition of the set readings or gospel pericopes assigned for a Sunday or feast day. They feature what Jean Leclerc has called exegesis by reminiscence, that is, the weaving together of verbal echoes from across scripture. Homily 1.1 focuses on the baptizer, and several details stand out. Firstly, the use of etymology of Judea, which is etymologized as confession, and of Jerusalem, which is etymologized as vision of peace. These etymologies are used to draw out mystical, allegorical, and anagogical meaning. Jerome's Hebrew onomasticon is one of the most commonly cited sources in Bede's commentaries, placing this homily within that kind of learned, literal, exegetical sphere. Secondly, Bede addresses the quandary of whether or not Christ ever baptized with water. We are told in the lection, as well as in the homily, that the Lord baptized with fire, but the question of whether or not he baptized with water is one that Bede addresses in this homily. And one of the third kind of issues that Bede addresses in this text is the baptizer's famous words, venit fortior me post me, quius non sum dignus procumbens solvere corrigiam calciamentorum eos. So there cometh after me one mightier than I, the latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to stoop down and loose. So we learn that this is not just an expression of humility on the part of John the Baptist and his devotion to Christ, but since John was believed initially to be the Christ in his own context and the expected bridegroom of the church, this is in fact a reference to Hebrew law and custom by the authors of the biblical text. A brother who was to take on a widowed sister-in-law would indicate that he no longer wished to take her as a bride by undoing his sandal and giving it to the man to whom she was to be married. So Bede's exegesis here is both anagogical as well as highly learned and informative, and completely reflective and representative of a scholarly monastic milieu. Bede's exegetical mode is dynamic. So 1-2 focuses on Christ, the incarnation, and John, the lection from John 1:15-18. Following the lectionary, each homily emphasizes a different figure or aspect in this pivotal period in salvation history. 1:3 best exemplifies the richness of Bede's exposition and focuses on Mary and women in the nativity narrative. Bede typologically links the Annunciation by the angel Gabriel to Mary with the serpent's temptation of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Bede emphasizes that the Davidic link at Luke 1:27 is through Mary, and links between the priestly tribe and the royal tribe are brought together in Christ through Mary. Mary is glossed etymologically in this homily as star of the sea, where it's understood, where the name is understood to underscore her singular and luminary nature in the tempest of this world. So the syntax of the angelic greeting, whereby there's a repetition in the words that are ascribed to Gabriel, and the Virgin's confusion at receiving this message, are kind of explained in stylistic terms. So Bede glosses the syntax of the biblical text, which is a very common feature of commentaries in which biblical stylistics are clarified. Further reflection is offered on St. Elizabeth and St. John the Baptist, who both function as precursors, and of Sarah and Abraham. Bede attempts to draw together coherently the trajectory of revelation in this homily. Again, Bede includes a kind of rather academic rumination on the angel and why we have a named angel at this point in the biblical text compared to unnamed angel, and Bede kind of ascribes this to the singularly prominent and important message that's being related here. 1:4 focuses on Elizabeth and John and mostly forms an exposition of the Magnificat, the Canticle of Mary. In 1:5, we hear that Mary did not enter the house of Elizabeth because she doubted the angelic message that she received, but to help her elderly cousin, who was an antitype of the Old Testament matriarch Sarah. The homily proceeds with verse-by-verse exposition, much like the biblical commentaries, and interestingly declares Saint Elizabeth as the first Christian prophet before John. The homily makes much of Elizabeth and the unborn infant John's reaction to the God spell, the good news, where the infant leaps in Elizabeth's womb. We then get 3 homilies on Christmas. 1:5 is shorter and clearly intended for liturgical use on Christmas Eve or its offices. It mostly deals with Joseph and the rationale for his actions. Literal and stylistic explication dominates. So Bede, for instance, in this homily, explains the verb come together, which is present in the biblical reading. It's clarified as betrothal rather than marital consummation. Bede engages in wordplay as well, so begotten as well as begetting. He makes various kinds of puns on these words, and etymology is also deployed in this particular homily. He's called Jesus, for he shall save his people. And although the angels did not openly call him Christ, Gabriel calls him the author of salvation and the savior of the people. Bede's skills as a commentator are drawn out here to develop figurative and mystical meaning from the letter of the text. Further etymological reflection is offered on Christ's nature, God with us, Emmanuel, both God and man. Bede addresses similarly curious exegetical quandaries, like the qualification firstborn, which implies or seems to imply that Mary had other children. Bede explains, however, that the firstborn are those who first open the womb, and that being the firstborn does not necessarily require successors. Bede returns to the etymology of Jesus or Savior and its significance. It's interesting to see Bede's methods as an anti-Achene exegete applied in theological and instructive ways like this, where such strategies are more informative in the biblical commentaries. 1:6 is the most elaborate of the Christmas homilies and seems to have been composed to supplement Gregory's homily on the same pericope or reading, where he claims not to have had time to do justice to the reading. This is what Gregory the Great claims in the kind of preface to his homilies. The preface to this particular homily. It's a mystical rumination on the biblical shepherds and the shepherds of the church, that is, all 3 orders of clergy, deacon, priest, and bishop. Bede has an overall kind of focus within this text on the episcopacy. Everyone Bede ruminates as a pastor, even those who are the head of a small household. So Bede here seems to be preaching to both clergy and the lay people, which could potentially suggest further context for use of this homily with lay congregations. Perhaps this was the main Christmas Day homily and would have been heard also by locals who attended Mass at the monastery. Homily 1:8 offers a reflection on John the Evangelist, on his feast day and his role in Revelation, which mostly consists of an exposition of his Neoplatonic framework for introducing the gospel in the Gospel of John and the nature of God, Christ, and Revelation. The teaching here is expository, but not for the uninitiated. Bede clearly has a very learned monastic personnel in mind with the exposition he's putting forward here. In 1:10 on the Holy Innocents, this frames Christ's escape and the persecution of the innocent as evidence of the unbreakable nature of salvation and deliverance. They wanted to kill Christ, but could not and did not. And following his escape, his survival achieved the true liberation for mankind that was achieved at Calvary. The homily on the octave of Christmas 1:11 focuses on the awkward topic of the circumcision and represents the cleansing of the body, or which Bede sees as representing the cleansing of the body to conform to spiritual purity. This was one of the most important feast days in Christianity, and the octave, the title that's given to the homily is the Octave of Christmas compared to its subject, circumcision, shows the order of liturgical precedence that's being given here. 1:12 explores how Christ came to be baptized by his follower and the lowliness of the incarnational event in which God comes down to man's level and functions therein. The remainder of the Christmastide cycle exhibits similarly interesting details and is deserving of a fuller treatment elsewhere. So in conclusion, Bede's homiletic exposition is different to that of the fathers, but consisted consistent with his biblical commentary, although it displays different applications and emphases. For example, we see etymology implied in new and instructive ways. The remarkability of Bede's homilies is that they became reified in the divine office. In my view, Bede is like a Western version of John Chrysostom, whose name means golden mouthed. His homilies are based on the Gospels and are structured by them, but innovate within the tradition of patristic homiletics. They began as original expositions, not patristic syntheses, and became accepted as authoritative in the same manner as Gregory's homilies. Given that Bede dedicated 2 liturgically oriented cycles of homilies to Advent and Christmas and Lent and Easter, it's clear that Bede found the seasons of Advent and Christmas, the beginning of the liturgical year, to be important, significant, and deserving of full attention as an exegete and homilist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear John, for this innovative topic and this beautiful presentation. And I think that we've reached the end of the conference. Are there any questions? I don't see any questions on YouTube. So are there any questions from the rest of the speakers for this session? Okay, John, go ahead.
Hi, well, thank you everyone for your paper. I had a question for Father Pistea, relating to this very interesting detail that you give in your presentation, that Christ was named Basil, right? Did I pick this up correctly, that before the baptism that he was given the name Basil? I'm just wondering what the sources are for that, and if that kind of relates to the Greek words basilios, and the connection there.
Yes, the basil was the word. Yes. Yes. It's an object like a cross and the basil, and yes, the believers believe that these elements give the sanctification of water, but no, it's a custom. Yes, but we have the cross and the basil, and we see in the first image on my presentation, yes, when the priest sanctified the water, he used the cross and the basil also. Yeah, the basil, yes, is from name from San Basilius, I think. Yes, so yes, come from.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Oh, Linda, you have a question. Please unmute your microphone.
Yes, sorry. Just an extra comment on Basil. Basil, I would have to look it up more, but I do like the connection between basilios. That would mean king, right? But basil is a herb, it's a medicinal herb. And I don't, when Gabriel was speaking, I was thinking that if you put the herb in the water, you somehow, cleanse it from germs. But I would have to look that up and see if there's any medicinal reason for basil being in the water. But I'll keep that in mind and I will look it up.
Yes, can be a medicinal plants.
Okay, good. Anything else? No, okay. Peter, would you like to say anything before we close this conference?
Just to thank the speakers. I think it's wonderful to kind of see these kind of themes and bringing different topics that relate to Christmas and the historical past. So I just want to say thanks.
That's great. On behalf of Dr. Konstantinos Zorbas and the Orthodox Academy of Crete and myself, I would like to thank you all of you for your participation in this year's conference. I would also like to thank our audience for their attention. And hopefully we will have another conference in the future next year. You're all welcome to rejoin us if you want with a relevant presentation. And perhaps there will be a small conversation about the proceedings of this conference. You should expect an email. I will talk with Dr. Zorbas about it. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Ευχαριστούμε
πάρα πολύ.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas.
Kola kala, do you say for Merry Christmas? Do you still say kola kala for that one as well?
Καλά
Yes.
Χριστούγεννα.
Okay, ευχαριστώ.
Yes. Okay, so bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Just
Bye.